Have you ever stopped to think about how life can suddenly turn upside down? Everything is going well, you feel like you have control, but in the blink of an eye, everything seems to fall apart. And that's exactly what makes the story of Job in the Bible so powerful and so timely. Job was a man like any of us. He worked hard, had a family he loved, hard-earned possessions, and lived a life that many would envy. But then, a storm hit. He lost everything: his possessions, his health, and even the support of those he cared about most. And what did he do? He questioned, he cried, he related, but he also discovered something transformative in the midst of all that. Today, we're going to dive into this story full of pain, doubt, and, surprisingly, hope. Because in the end, Job isn't just about suffering, but about dealing with life's worst storms and finding greater meaning in the midst of chaos. So brace yourself, because this isn't just an old story. It's an invitation to reflect on our own journey. Are you ready to discover what Job has to teach people here and now? Why would a just and loving God allow Job, a man considered to be upright and faithful, to face so much suffering? This is one of the most difficult questions that Christians and scholars have asked over the centuries. The story of Job challenges us to understand the divine purpose behind pain, while also presenting us with an example of unshakable faith in the face of extreme circumstances. Job was not only a man blessed with wealth, health, and family, he was also an example of spiritual righteousness, and yet his life was devastated in an inexplicable way. He lost everything: his possessions, his children, and even his health. The narrative shows us a disconcerting scenario where Satan challenges God, teaching that Job's faithfulness depends only on his blessings. God then allows Job to be tested, but without revealing the reason to Job himself. This story raises crucial questions that connect us directly to our own experiences. Why bad things happen to good people? How can we maintain our faith when everything falls apart? In this video, we will explore the theological reasons behind Job's suffering and what it teaches us about God's character and our own faith, and the greater purpose that may be behind pain. If you have ever faced moments of suffering or questioned the reason for difficult situations in your life, this video is for you. Stay with me until the end, and together, we will seek profound answers that can bring clarity, spiritual reconciliation, and even renew your trust in God. To understand Job's suffering, it is essential to delve into the context in which his story unfolds. The Book of Job, one of the oldest works in the Bible, presents a unique setting. It is not set in Israel, nor does it align directly with the history of any specific biblical nation. Job lived in the land of the United States, a place of unknown exact location, but often considered outside the Israelite territory. He is described as an upright man who feared God and who turned away from evil qualities that made him exemplary. Job was extraordinarily prosperous for his time. He had large herds of cattle, a large family, and an irreproachable reputation in the mentality of the time. Wealth and prosperity were often interpreted as signs of divine blessing. This view was widely shared by his contemporaries and even by his friends who were more. Later, they would make mistaken interpretations about Job's suffering. However, the narrative takes us to a spiritual plane beyond immediate human understanding. In the prologue of the book, we find an intriguing scene in heaven where Satan presents himself before God. Here, Satan is not only an enemy, but someone who challenges the character and motivation of humanity. He continues to teach that Job's faithfulness to God is not genuine, but a response to the protection and blessings he has received. Satan questions whether Job fears God without reason. It is a direct attack not only on Job's character, but on the very relationship between God and man. God allows Satan to test Job by taking away everything he has except his life. This divine consent does not mean an abandonment of Job, but rather a sovereign permission that aims to prove something greater. Job's tests begin abruptly and in a devastating manner. He loses his possessions, his children, and his health in quick succession. Despite his extreme pain, Job initially responds with remarkable words. "The Lord gave, the Lord took. Blessed be the name of the Lord." His initial reaction demonstrates a deep trust in God, even without understanding the reason for his suffering. However, the story doesn't stop there. The arrival of Job's friends Eliph makes Bildad and Zophar brings a new level of complexity. They believe that Job's suffering must be the result of some hidden sin, reflecting the prevailing retributive theology of the time. The idea that people reap what they sow. They insist that Job confess a sin he did not commit, further increasing his anguish. This contextualization helps us understand the spiritual and cultural setting in which Job's story takes place. His pain is not only physical but also emotional and spiritual. He struggles not only with the losses he has suffered, but also with the incomprehension of his friends and the silence of God. As we progress through the video, it is important to remember that Job was not informed about the heavenly dialogue between God and Satan. He did not know that his suffering was part of something much greater, a plan that transcended his immediate understanding. This deliberate omission from the biblical narrative invites us to reflect on our own relationship with God, how we react when we do not understand his ways. With this in mind, we move on to the next crucial point, the purpose of Job. What was God trying to teach, not only to Job, but also to all of us who read this story thousands of years later? Job's suffering is one of the Bible's most profound mysteries, but the narrative offers us clues that point to God's purposes here. We will explore three fundamental aspects: the test of fidelity, divine sovereignty, and the impact on the testimony that reveal the underlying reasons for Job's suffering. 1. The test of fidelity. From the beginning of the story, it is clear that Satan believes that Job's fidelity to God is conditioned on material blessings. He challenges God by claiming that Job serves him only because he has been amply rewarded. This argument touches on a crucial point. Is our devotion to God authentic, or does it depend on what we receive from him by allowing Satan to test Job? God is not only defending the age of his servant, but also demonstrating that genuine love for him transcends circumstances. Job goes through terrible losses, his possessions, his family, and his health, but does not deny his faith. He questions, he laments, and seeks answers, but remains faithful. This aspect of the narrative challenges us to reflect on our own faith. What motivates us to trust in God? Job shows us that true fidelity does not depend on comfort, but on a deep and unshakable relationship with the Creator. 2. The sovereignty of God. Another central theme is divine sovereignty in the heavenly dialogue. God allows Satan to test Job, but with clear limits. This highlights that even in the midst of chaos, God remains in control. Satan does not act independently, but within God's sovereign permission. This point is often uncomfortable for us. Why would God allow suffering even though the full reasons are not revealed? The story of Job reminds us that God operates on a much larger plane than we can comprehend. He does not act arbitrarily, but with purpose, even when that purpose is beyond our vision. A powerful aspect of this sovereignty is that God did not need to prove anything to Satan or Job. However, he uses the story of Job to teach us about faith, perseverance, and trust. The sovereignty of God challenges us to trust him even when we do not understand his ways. TR. Impact on testimony. Job's suffering was not just for him. His story becomes a powerful testimony for future generations. J is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible as an example of patience and unwavering faith. His suffering and subsequent restoration are a living testament that God is faithful and just. Furthermore, Job's journey helps us to reevaluate the way we view suffering. Instead of seeing it as a punishment or a sign of abandonment, we can recognize it as an opportunity to spiritual growth and a means of glorifying God, even without immediate answers. Job remains a model of how to persevere and trust. The purpose of Job's suffering also connects to the idea that God is teaching something to everyone involved: Job, his friends, and us readers. Job learns to trust God in an even deeper way, recognizing his sovereignty and majesty. His friends, who initially misjudged suffering as a result of sin, are corrected by God, showing that his ways of operating are beyond human logic to us. The story of Job serves as a powerful reminder that suffering does not mean the absence of God. He is present even in the silence and uses our hardships to reveal His glory and shape us into His image. Ultimately, the purpose of Job's suffering cannot be fully understood in human terms, and perhaps that is the whole point, trusting God even without all the answers. The book of Job challenges us to let go of the idea that all our experiences must make immediate sense. Instead, we are called to recognize that God is sovereignly good and trustworthy. Even when circumstances are painful as they are, we move forward. Let's explore how these lessons of suffering and purpose apply to our lives today. What the story of Job can teach us about faith, perseverance, and hope in the midst of our own challenges. The story of Job is not just an ancient tale. It carries practical and transformative lessons for us today. Every aspect of his suffering, his questions, and his restoration offers us valuable insights on how to face life's challenges with faith and trust. Let's explore 3 fundamental lessons that we can apply in our daily lives, embracing the mystery, growing spiritually, and waiting for restoration. One of the most striking lessons of the book of Job is that we will not always understand the purpose of suffering. Job, despite all his dialogue with friends and questioning of God, did not receive a direct explanation for the reason for his pain. When God finally answered, He did not provide justifications but reminded Job of His sovereignty and majesty. This teaches us that there are mysteries in God that are beyond our understanding. In Isaiah 55:8-9 we read, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." So like Job, we are called to trust in God, even without clear answers in practice. This means that we must abandon the need to understand everything. Instead of focusing, we know why we suffer. We must ask ourselves how we can glorify God in the midst of it. Accepting the mystery is not resigning ourselves to suffering, but trusting that God is in control, even when we don't see the whole picture. Another important lesson is that suffering, although painful, can shape us and make us grow spiritually. Job began his journey as a righteous man, but at the end of the story, he declares that his relationship with God was transformed. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42:5, suffering forces us to depend on God in ways we may never have before it reveals our frailties. It exposes our need for a Savior and brings us closer to the heart of God. This spiritual growth does not happen automatically. It is necessary to open our hearts to learn and trust during difficult times. To apply this, we can ask ourselves how suffering is teaching me something I would not learn. Otherwise, it can be humility or even a new perception of who God is. Just like Job, our pain can lead us to a deeper experience with God. One of the most inspiring parts of the story of Job is that his suffering was not the end of the final chapter, is when we see God restore all that Job lost by doubling his possessions and blessing him with a new family. This restoration does not erase the pain he suffered, but shows that God is faithful to shape our darkest situations. This teaches us that even when we are in the midst of suffering, we can hope for restoration. This restoration may not come exactly as we expect. Sometimes it is spiritual rather than material, or happens at a time we do not understand. However, we can have confidence that God is able to bring redemption to our circumstances. In practice, living with hope means remembering that God never abandons us, even when all seems lost. Job teaches us that we can trust in God's character. He is good, faithful, and always working for our good. Today we face different forms of suffering: loss of loved ones, financial crises, illnesses, or emotional challenges. Although our experiences are different from Job's, the lessons we learn from his story are universal. For example, when we face financial difficulties, we can remember that Job lost all his wealth but did not lose his faith. In times of mourning, his initial response, "The Lord gave, the Lord took. Blessed be His name." The Lord's story inspires us to praise God even in the midst of pain. Furthermore, the story of Job helps us deal with God's silence. Often during times of suffering, we may feel abandoned or ignored. However, Job shows us that God is present even when we don't feel Him. This knowledge gives us the strength to continue trusting even in the midst of silence. A practical application of these lessons is personal reflection. Ask yourself, how can I glorify God in the midst of my struggles? What is suffering teaching me about my faith and my relationship with God? These questions help us transform our challenges into opportunities for spiritual growth. Another application is caring for others. Just as Job's friends initially failed to comfort him, we can often be quick to judge or give inappropriate advice. Learning to offer genuine support without trying to explain away the suffering of others is a powerful lesson that we can apply to our relationships. Finally, it is important to remember that suffering is temporary. Job's restoration reminds us that God has a greater plan and that in the end, His goodness prevails. Even if complete restoration only happens in eternity, we can live with the hope that God always fulfills His promises now. We have explored how the lessons of Job's story apply to our lives. It remains to address some of the more difficult questions this story raises. Why does God allow suffering in the first place? How to reconcile His sovereignty with human pain? The story of Job is rich in meaning, but it also raises profound questions that many of us ask when faced with suffering. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Suffering is always a divine test. How to reconcile God's sovereignty with human pain? Let's explore these questions, offering theological clarity for those seeking to better understand the purpose of suffering. 1. Why did God allow Job to suffer? If He is good? This is perhaps the most frequently asked question when we look at the suffering in Job's life. If God is completely good and loving, why would He allow someone so righteous to face so much suffering? The answer lies in a crucial aspect of divine sovereignty. God has a greater purpose that goes beyond our immediate understanding. Job's suffering was not a reflection of God's wickedness or absence, but an opportunity to reveal His glory and teach eternal lessons about faithfulness, faith, and trust. God did not cause the suffering but allowed it to happen. That it happened within clear limits, this reminds us that evil does not have ultimate control, but is always subject to divine authority. It is important to understand that even allowing suffering, God continues to be good. God's goodness is not measured by immediate circumstances, but by the eternal purpose that He accomplishes through them. In the case of Job's suffering revealed a genuine faith that did not depend on material blessings, but on a deep relationship with the Creator. 2. Job suffered because of his sins. A central issue in the book of Job is the idea that suffering would be a punishment for hidden sins. This was the interpretation of Job's friends who believed in retributive theology, the idea that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked for them. Job's suffering could only be the result of some transgression. However, the book of Job clearly refutes this idea from the beginning. The text states that Job was blameless and upright, fearing God, and that he turned away from evil. Job 1:1. His suffering was not a consequence of sins, but a test of faith allowed by God for a greater purpose. This lesson is important for us today because we often interpret suffering as a sign of divine disapproval. It teaches us that not all suffering is a consequence of something wrong we have done. Instead, it can be an opportunity to demonstrate our trust in God and grow spiritually. 3. Suffering is always a test from God. Another frequently asked question is whether all suffering is a test from God, as it was with Job. Although God allows suffering in our lives, it is not always a direct test. Like Job's, the Bible gives different reasons for suffering, consequences of personal choices. Some sufferings result directly from our decisions, results from the fall. The world is broken by sin, and suffering is part of this reality. Tests of faith, as in the case of Job. God can allow trials to shape our character or glorify His name. Therefore, while not all suffering is a divine test, all types of suffering can be used by God for a greater purpose. This reminds us that regardless of the cause, we can trust that He is working on our behalf. 4. How to reconcile divine sovereignty with human pain. This is one of the most difficult theological questions. If God is sovereign, how to allow your children to suffer? The answer lies in the tension between God's sovereignty and human free will, as well as in the reality that we live in a fallen world. God is not indifferent to human suffering in the story of Job. We see that he knows every detail of the situation and sets clear limits for Satan. This shows us that suffering does not escape God's control, even when it seems beyond our understanding. Furthermore, suffering leads us to depend more on God. He reminds us that our strength and comfort come from Him and not from external circumstances. Ultimately, divine sovereignty does not eliminate pain, but gives us the assurance that God is present and working even in the most difficult situations. 5. How can we find hope in suffering? One of Job's greatest lessons is that suffering is not the end of the story. Even in the midst of his pain, Job maintained hope in the goodness of God. He declared, "I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand upon the earth." Job 19:25. Today, that same hope is available to us. We can trust that God is faithful to bring redemption and restoration, whether in this life or the next eternity. The story of Job reminds us that God never abandons His own, and that in the right time, He brings restoration. Answering the theological questions raised by the story of Job helps us to recon our faith with the realities of life. Job teaches us that God is sovereign, just and good, even when we face difficult situations. Suffering is part of our journey, but it is never without purpose. With this, we are invited to trust in God, knowing that He is always in control. With these questions addressed, we conclude that suffering can teach us to trust God more and to seek answers in Him, and not in our own understandings. We have reached the end of our journey through the story of Job, but the lessons it offers us continue to echo in our lives. Suffering, as we have seen, is not only a burden, but also an opportunity for us to grow spiritually, recognize the sovereignty of God, and witness His goodness, even in the midst of difficulties. The story of Job teaches us, first of all, that God is sovereign over all things. Even when we face adversity, we can be sure that nothing happens outside His control. He is not only the creator of the universe, but also the attentive caretaker of our lives, knowing every detail of our pains. Secondly, we learn that suffering is not necessarily a punishment. Job, a righteous man, suffered not for his sins, but to demonstrate his faithfulness and to glorify God. This truth sets us free from the idea that all our difficulties are the result of something we did wrong. Finally, Job reminds us that in due time, God brings restoration. He not only restored what Job had lost, but also transformed his relationship with the Creator. Just as Job declared, "Now my eyes see you," Job 42:5. Suffering can lead us to a deeper understanding of God's presence and character. How to apply these lessons in our daily lives? First, when we face challenges, we must remember that God is present, even in silence. He invites us to trust in Him, even when we do not understand the purpose of our trials. In addition, we can use our pain to draw closer to God, instead of turning away in times of difficulty. Job teaches us to seek answers and comfort in Him. This does not mean that we should hide our questions, but rather take them to God in prayer with honesty and faith. Finally, we must live with hope. Just as God restored Job, He can also bring redemption to our circumstances, even if complete restoration only happens in eternity. We can live confident that suffering is never the final chapter of our story. That starts from the story. Job's story spoke to your heart the most. How these lessons can transform the way you face life's challenges. Reflect on this and share this video with someone who may need to hear this message. Thank you very much for following this reflection on the story of Job and the purpose of his suffering. Job's narrative is one of the most challenging and transformative in the Bible, inviting us to trust in God even when we face moments of doubt, pain, or silence. If this video brought you theological clarity or spiritual comfort, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who may also be facing difficult questions about suffering and God's purpose. After all, Job's story is not just about a man from the past, but about all of us who seek meaning amid life's challenges. Before I close, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. Which lesson from Job's story do you think most applies to your life today? Answer in the comments, because your perspective can inspire other people who are watching this video. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming content that will further deepen your faith and understanding of the scriptures. Thank you very much for watching, and may God bless your journey with peace and hope. Until next time.